students will often introduce slang to me with the following caveat. Well, it's not a real word, but we say chillax for when we're hanging out, chilling, and relaxing. So what do these students mean when they say chillax is not a real word? I mean, it acts like a word. It's a word that they know and are telling me about as something that is meaningful. And so I'm pretty sure that what they mean is that this word chillax is not in a standard dictionary yet. That's when a word becomes a real word. When you think about dictionaries, they hold quite a revered place in our culture. Go into a university library and you will see a big unabridged dictionary on a pedestal. And it is put up there as the place where we can go and find answers to things. It's up there high, it's open, ready for us to go consult. For many people, a copy of the Oxford English Dictionary is often a prize acquisition in the library. There are people who read the dictionary for pleasure. After all, it is a wonderful resource. It's just full of knowledge. Supreme Court justices have been known to turn to dictionaries to define key terms for their decisions. When we have a question about a word, we say, look it up in the dictionary. Now I want to step back from that expression, look it up in the dictionary. The dictionary assumes that all dictionaries are exactly the same. Of course, as soon as we step back from that, we know that there are human hands behind dictionaries. But typically, we can't name the editor of our dictionary. Our trust is in the institution, not in the specific people behind it. In this lecture, we'll talk about our curious relationship with dictionaries, the primary resource for capturing the English vocabulary. And we're going to talk about the very human decisions that go into creating a dictionary. This is a lecture that's going to examine many things that we take for granted about where we can find answers about words. And in the process, I hope that it will answer some questions that you may have about how dictionaries get made. So first, we'll talk about what we expect of our dictionaries, and then I'll provide some details about how they are actually made. Modern dictionary makers are put in something of a bind given how we see their work as authoritative. Lexicographers, the people who make dictionaries, see their task as a descriptive one. In other words, they see themselves as examining the evidence about words and then trying to capture the meaning of a word in the dictionary. They are tracking language. They're recording change. They're well aware that the language is always changing, and they're trying to keep up with it. However, we as dictionary users often turn to dictionaries not just to see how we use a word, but to see how we should use a word, or what a word really means, as opposed to perhaps what we're using it to mean. And we need to realize that when we say what it really means, what we're talking about is what it has traditionally meant or what it has historically meant. There's a way in which we don't always trust ourselves to know what a word means or how to use it correctly, and so we'll go to a dictionary. And that can be a good idea. Sometimes you'll run into a word and you think, what does that mean? And a dictionary is a wonderful place to go. One of the things that happens there is that we go to the dictionary not just as a descriptive resource, but also as a prescriptive one. Now, this prescriptive-descriptive divide is a fundamental distinction in linguistics. So let me define these terms. Prescriptivism, coming from the verb prescribe, is about telling people how they should use language, the do's and don'ts of language. Descriptivism, from describe, is the process of describing how people actually use the language. Linguists see their job as fundamentally a descriptive one, that they are interested in language as a human phenomenon, and that they want to see and understand how it works. Modern lexicographers also see their job as a descriptive one. But at least some dictionaries want to help users know about usage, that they know people are coming to dictionaries to figure out whether they might be judged for using a word in a particular way or for using a word at all. And so dictionary makers often include things like usage labels or usage notes, and we'll return to those in a bit. Now I want to pause here for a moment to talk about this prescriptive-descriptivism binary just a bit more. I don't want to dismiss prescriptivism as something that is unnatural to the use of language. And sometimes linguists are criticized for doing that they will say descriptivism is the study of language, and then there's prescriptivism over here telling people what they should and shouldn't do. There's a linguist named Deborah Cameron who's written a wonderful book called Verbal Hygiene. And the argument she makes in that book is that once you have a community of speakers, you will have some speakers telling other speakers how to talk, what's right and what's wrong. And this is what she calls verbal hygiene. So what she's arguing is that prescriptivism is not unnatural to language communities, that as soon as you have a group of people together, you're going to have people prescribing things. And it's important to note that prescriptivism is part of maintaining a standard version of a language. As we'll talk about throughout this course, prescriptivism can make people feel really anxious, though, or it can make them feel inferior about their language or the way they use language, and that's not really helpful or justified. So throughout the course, we'll actually study prescriptivism just like we're studying other language phenomena, trying to understand how it works, where and why we seek it out, why do we let people tell us what to do, when should we trust them, when should we maybe ask some questions. And that returns me to dictionaries. So as I mentioned, in the case of dictionaries, are assuming them to be at least partly prescriptive rather than fully descriptive puts dictionary makers in a difficult spot. They're trying to track what we do and include that in the dictionary. Sometimes, though, people get really upset that they're including illegitimate words, words that people understand, but maybe they don't like them or they don't respect them. The dictionary makers often are labeling things as slang or colloquial to describe how those words are used in the language. The issue here is that we as users may then go in there and say, oh, well, it's slang and it will always be slang. Or it's colloquial, I can never use it in formal language. And lexicographers would say, well, no, change can still happen. History tells us that dictionary users really care a lot about usage labels like slang and colloquial. And many dictionaries rely on them. They rely on labels such as non-standard, colloquial, slang, offensive. There was a very famous uproar about usage labels, and this happened with Webster's third New International Dictionary, unabridged. This dictionary, which was published in the early 60s, eliminated almost all usage labels, including colloquial, proper, improper, erroneous. And the hubbub was about the fact that there was no usage label for ain't. The dictionary was slammed as being overly permissive, as accelerating the deterioration of the English language, and I'm pretty much quoting from newspaper coverage when I say that. The treatment of ain't came under particular scrutiny, and people said, it shows approval for the mediocre, and it comforts the ignorant. These comments reveal many people's expectations that dictionaries will not just record the language, but also exercise judgment, that they will set standards for the language. So let's turn to a few examples to look at how dictionaries handle this when they're trying to let in new words and figure out how to help us as users think about how they're used. At the end of the last lecture, I asked you if you would include yada yada. And included in that, I asked you if you would include yada yada or yada yada yada. If you decided to put it in, you're in good company. The Oxford English Dictionary made a similar decision and added this in 2006. The OED puts it in with 2, yada yada. The American Heritage Dictionary puts it in with 3, yada yada yada. Now, did you decide to give it a label? The OED did. They labeled it as colloquial, and they defined it this way: indicating, usually dismissively, that further details are predictable or evident from what has preceded. And then they cite blah, blah, blah as synonymous. I myself strongly associate yada yada with Seinfeld, and I assumed that that's where it came from. But the OED tracks it back to 1967 and Lenny Bruce. So why, you ask, did the OED not put it in the late 1960s? And the answer is because they were tracking it to see if it would stick. This gets us to a key question about how dictionaries are made. How do new words get into the dictionary? And how do lexicographers determine what it means? Lexicographers, as I said, are tracking the language. They're tracking it by reading, and now they're also tracking it by using new databases that are available online. They're watching to see how a new word is moving through the lexicon. Sometimes new words start in more specialized registers. That could be scientific registers, or that could be something like slang, and then they move to wider usage. Now, sometimes really specialized terms get in, but often lexicographers are waiting to see if a word will get from a more specialized part of the lexicon into broader use. And they were clearly waiting with yada, yada, yada. Lexicographers rely on printed work. And when they're doing that, they talk about this as a very old-fashioned practice, that they're underlining words, they're bracketing the passage in which the word is identified, and then they are using that to try to determine the meaning of the word. They catalog all this material, and then if they decide that a word is established enough in usage, it goes into the dictionary. There are now new databases that allow us to track words even more widely and more quickly. Just imagine what a resource like Google Books, with millions of books in it, can reveal. And I want to introduce you to two databases that you can go to online. They're publicly available. One is called the Corpus of Contemporary American English, and the other is called the Corpus of Historical American English. The Corpus of Contemporary American English is over 400 million words, which is really an enormous database. And it covers 5 different registers of the language: spoken, newspapers, fiction, magazines, and academic language. And it covers from 1990 to the present day. So you can go there to track really recent change. The Corpus of Historical American English covers the last 200 years. It goes back to 1800. It's again over 400 million words. It is, however, all written. So these are 2 new resources that we can use to study language change over the past 200 years. So let's look at what COHA, the historical database, can tell us about yada yada. If we chart this out, we'll see that the hits start to come in the 1990s and in the 2000s. You can see why the OED let this in the 2000s, but really waited until then. If we go to COCA, this is the one that covers the last 20 years, and look at the word bling, which is a much newer word, we can see that even in the 1990s, bling was not getting a lot of use, but starting in the 2000s, you start to see a real increase in use, and bling has gotten into many standard dictionaries. Now, I have to say, when I first heard bling, I didn't think it had a shot of sticking in the language. When it first came in, it came in as bling bling, and I thought, people aren't going to use that word. But in fact, it simplified down to bling, and it spread out of specialized use in slang, often hip-hop, and I started to hear it being used in clothing stores. I saw it in the newspaper when people were talking about bling. And let's talk about defining a word like bling. So you're a lexicographer. You collect lots of data on usage, and now you have to define the word. Let's talk about some basic principles that you would need to adhere to in terms of defining that word. One is you need to avoid circularity. You cannot define a word by itself or by things in its family of words unless the related words are defined independently. What do I mean? I mean, you can't define beautiful as full of beauty and then define beauty as the state of being beautiful. You're just sending users back and forth between these two words without defining them. So that's one principle. Another principle is that all the words in a definition should appear in the dictionary, so that if people don't know a word in the definition, they can look it up. And then when you're going through this and trying to define things, the nice thing is that you usually would not have to do it on your own. That at most dictionaries, there's a multi-layered editorial process where you have people collecting the evidence, doing an initial definition, and then it goes through multiple editors before it actually gets published. In the end, definitions rest on usage. That lexicographers are looking at context to see what a word means. So if we return to bling, we've got lots and lots of examples where bling seems to refer to jewelry. You get quotes like, cars, cash, and bling, or boost the bling with an eye-catching cocktail ring. It's clear there that bling is about jewelry. But then lexicographers have to take seriously examples like this one. I do love a little bling on clothes. Here, it doesn't seem to be about jewelry. It seems to be about other shiny, sparkly things that might show up on clothes. So the definition in the dictionary needs to account for that example too. So given that definitions rest on usage, what would you do with a word like peruse? This is a word that is changing during our lifetime. I often give this word to my students and ask them to go survey 5 to 10 people and ask them what this word means. So they go out and they talk to people and they have people saying, well, it means something like skim or browse, scan things. Sometimes their respondents will say that it involves walking, so that you're perusing the shelves at the grocery store. I then say, go look it up in a standard dictionary. And students go look it up, and what they see is that it means something like read carefully. They often then come to class and say, well, then what does the word mean? And I say, well, what do you use it to mean? And they will say, skim or browse or scan. And I say, okay, well then if that's what we all use it to mean, that's what it means. The American Heritage Dictionary is trying to handle this change that's happening all around us between read carefully and skim. And you can imagine how this might happen, that if somebody says, I'm going to peruse the newspaper to see if I can find a car, they're perusing the ads. They mean it to mean read carefully, but I hear it and think they're just skimming. So the American Heritage deals with this as a usage note. What they write is, peruse has long meant to read thoroughly. Sometimes people use it to mean to glance over, skim, as in, I only had a moment to peruse the manual quickly. But this usage is widely considered an error. In a 1988 survey, 66% of the usage panel found it unacceptable, and in 1999, 58% still rejected it. So who is this usage panel? You see it quoted in something like that usage note where they're saying X percentage of the usage panel doesn't like this construction. Well, if you go to the front matter of the American Heritage Dictionary, you can actually find the names of everybody on the usage panel. It's about 200 well-known critics, writers, and scholars. It includes people like Sherman Alexie, Maxine Hong Kingston, Annie Dillard, Calvin Trillin. Harold Bloom's on the panel, as is Henry Louis Gates, David Sedaris, Garrison Keillor, Nina Totenberg, and Antonin Scalia. And as of fall of 2006, so am I. So I was asked to join the usage panel, and I gladly accepted. What this means is that every year or so, I get a questionnaire. And it includes questions about, for example, pronunciation. I remember one that said, should you say hegemony or hegemony? Which one is acceptable or both? It will ask about new meanings. For example, is it acceptable to use quote to mean quotation? And I have to say I do that all the time. You'll get questions about usage sometimes. For example, can you use mitigate with against? So you can mitigate things or mitigate against things. So the editors send us all this questionnaire. They then compile our answers, and that's how they get to this 68% of the usage panel thinks this is acceptable or not. Now you can imagine, given what I do, this question of acceptability is quite a conundrum. Is using quote for quotation acceptable? I often know, when I look at the question, that this is a change in progress with a new form, a new meaning, a new pronunciation coming into the language. But I also know that, for example, my colleagues in the English department might judge students for using these forms. I feel like my role as a descriptive linguist on the panel is really crucial here. That no matter what dictionary makers see as their task, speakers and English teachers will often look to the usage panel to see what will be judged and what won't. I bring to the panel my perspective that language is always changing, that the history of the language gives us this perspective that you will always have people worrying about decay, and the language will always be changing despite that. I know that, for example, Benjamin Franklin did not like the verb to notice. It had been a noun. He didn't like it used as a verb. He didn't like progress, which had been a verb, being used as a noun. And he asked Noah Webster to criticize these forms in his dictionary. So I look at that and I think, okay, we now look at that and think, why was Benjamin Franklin so worried about that? And that I should keep that in mind in terms of what the usage panel is worried about. So if I have good evidence that something is being used, like quote to mean quotation, then I think my job is to try to get the usage panel to accept that so that people can go to the dictionary and see, okay, that's something that I could use without judgment. That dictionaries should change with the language and that may help change attitudes about what forms are acceptable or not. Now, American Heritage was a pioneer in creating usage labels, and this was partly in response to the uproar over Webster's third. That Webster's third was the one that had taken out usage labels, and there was this sense that people wanted guidance, and American Heritage decided that they would profit from providing more guidance. And it really does allow them to handle language change or tricky usage questions, such as whether or not the word gay is seen as offensive in reference to the gay community. And the editors try hard to give us some perspective on the role of the usage panel. They're actually quite explicit about how they think we should think about the usage panel. And this is worth quoting at length in terms of what they tell us to do. They write, "The usage panel should not be thought of as an academy empowered to rule on all questions of disputed usage. That is an expedient that the English-speaking world has rejected since the 18th century. And in a world where English is established as the language of a heterogeneous international community, the idea that any group or individual might arrogate the authority to fix standards seems not only illiberal, but absurd. Ultimately, readers will want to make up their own minds about each of such usage issues, but the opinions of the panel may provide a useful point of reference." But does anybody read the front matter of a dictionary so that they can see that note? I don't think so. I mean, I do, but I think most people don't. Do people really think it's illiberal and absurd to give that power to the usage panel? At some level, I think the answer is yes, that in the US, we've never established a language academy, neither has Britain. We've never had an academy that says this is right and this is wrong. But we do continue to look for people and resources to tell us correct from incorrect, not just to tell us how a word used to be used or what is standard, but often we're looking for what is right and what is wrong. And that is what I'm going to be asking you to think critically about throughout this course. I think that we have a real responsibility to be thoughtful users of dictionaries, to recognize dictionaries' goals and the challenges that they face when they're trying to keep up with us. We need to recognize our own authority to know what words mean and balance that with the information that we find in dictionaries. After all, lexicographers, in the end, are relying on us to tell them what words mean. Dictionaries are an incredibly useful and important resource, but as I hope this lecture has been emphasizing for you, they are very human in their creation, and they are trying to capture a language that won't stand still. I think it could actually be helpful if at the end of a dictionary title you added the date in which it was published. So you had something like the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language in 2012, because that would highlight for us that this is a snapshot of the language at a given moment. So, I am saying that there are times when we could question dictionaries, and there are times when people very publicly do, that they think dictionaries have gotten it wrong. Let's think about the word irregardless. I had asked you at the end of the last lecture if you would put that into your dictionary. Now, I would guess we have a split decision on that. There are many people who really don't like this word, who think that it's an illegitimate word, who think that it is illogical or redundant. The problem for those people, of course, is that it is used, and lexicographers feel beholden to include things that we use. The American Heritage Dictionary does include irregardless, and they define it as regardless and label it as non-standard. The American Heritage notes that this is probably a blend of irrespective and regardless. They then include a usage note. This is a word that they think merits a usage note, and I would agree. They say, really, if you think about it, this word is no more redundant than a word like debone or unravel, which really are saying the same thing twice. But they go on to note that irregardless is, and here I quote, considered a blunder for decades and will probably continue to be so. And I think they're right, that this is a word that is stigmatized as being wrong or illegitimate, and I'm not sure that's going to change. But I think that we do need to take seriously that this is a word that people use, and they often use it when they're trying to be more formal, that this may be their more formal version. And life is long. Non-standard words sometimes become standard. The word mob used to be considered an illegitimate word, and now doesn't seem illegitimate at all. The label that American Heritage is using of non-standard is trying to capture the judgment that people make of that word, but there's nothing inherent in the word that is non-standard. Not all words in language are logical. And many, many words no longer mean what they used to mean. It's a fallacy to think that they should do that, and that's something that I'll pick up again in a later lecture. So, to conclude this lecture, I've been talking about our expectations of dictionaries. What dictionary makers think they're trying to do in terms of tracking and defining words, and the power that we give to them through our expectations of their authority. Given that, it can seem like dictionaries must always have been there. We are so reliant on this as a resource to know things about words. But Shakespeare didn't have an English dictionary. And in the next lecture, I will provide you with a brief look at how the English dictionary came to be the resource that it is today. And we'll talk about the stunning accomplishment of the Oxford English Dictionary, the massive resource on which we'll be relying for many of the stories of words that I'll be telling. Who in the world said, "Let's create a dictionary that tells the history of every word in the English language"? You will find out in the next lecture.